Strangers, let's open this episode with a thought experiment, shall we? Imagine something hideous has happened in your community. Now picture an array of teenaged archetypes in a police lineup. The jock, the nerd, the homecoming queen, the goth. Based on impression alone, with a complete lack of evidence, who are you most suspicious of? Consider your answer and, more importantly, why you chose it. In the search for answers to the unimaginably evil, why do we scapegoat? And how different is the root of that evil to the root of one's impulse to kill in the first place? Welcome to Strange and Unexplained with me, Daisy Egan. I've been putting off doing this story for a few reasons. One, and probably the most obvious, is that it involves horrific violence to children, which is always uncomfortable, to say the least. The second is that I've met one of the main characters in this story, and it just brings into stark relief the reality that these are real people for whom this case has shaped their lives. And I know rehashing it can be traumatizing. On the other hand, stories like these also help shape our culture in general, which is why, of course, we keep coming back to them. Underneath the horrific crime that was committed, or perhaps surrounding it, is the story of incredibly weak police work, a broken justice system, and a media frenzy that fed off fears, prejudice, and misinformation. I was largely unaware of this case when it happened. I was 13. My mom died 4 days after the triple murder, and my attention was solidly not focused on this story. For the most part, I have avoided this story altogether in the ensuing 30 years. I'd seen the mugshots of the 3 very young men, children really, accused of the murders, and I knew the vague details of the murders themselves, and I knew that many felt a terrible injustice had been carried out in the courts. I didn't know enough to have an opinion on the matter, and I didn't really have any interest in knowing anything more about the original tragedy at the heart of the case. But I have this podcast, and many people have asked me to cover this case. And so here we are. On the afternoon of May 5th, 1993, 8-year-olds Christopher Byer, Stevie Branch, and Michael Moore took their bikes out together after school, as they often did. By 8 p.m., Christopher's stepfather, John Mark Byers, called the West Memphis, Arkansas police to say his stepson had not returned home. I know some younger listeners might have trouble understanding how 3 8-year-olds were allowed to just go off on their bicycles alone for hours on end. I'm going to further blow your mind by saying they were almost certainly not wearing helmets. But this is truly how things were in the before times. Movies like Stand By Me, rest in peace, Rob Reiner, and The Goonies and shows like Stranger Things are not that far off insofar as portrayals of free-range kids whose parents had no idea nor much interest in where their kids were for days at a time. But it was tragedies such as this one that changed all that. Within an hour and a half of the Byers' call, Stevie and Michael's moms, Pamela and Dana, had called to report their sons missing as well. Dana said she'd last seen her son around 6 p.m. riding his bike with his friends. Pamela had been at work until around 9 p.m. and hadn't seen Michael since that morning when he'd left for school. Michael's stepfather, Terry Hobbs, had allegedly gone out looking for the boys sometime that evening, but apparently didn't call Pamela at work to let her know he was concerned. She didn't know her son was missing until she got home from work after 9 p.m. A cursory search of Robin Hood Hills, a 4-mile wooded area the boys had been known to play in, was conducted that evening, and nothing was found. The next morning, Chief Inspector Gary Gitchell announced he'd be heading up a search for the boys. That afternoon, the bodies of all 3 boys were found in a muddy stream bed. All 3 boys were found nude and hogtied with shoelaces. It was immediately noted that Christopher Byers' genitals were mutilated. An expert examining Michael's autopsy photos noted what he thought could be a bruise caused by a belt buckle on Michael's body. Terry Hobbs, Michael's stepdad, stated he had disciplined Michael shortly before the disappearance with a belt buckle. Strands of hair-like material were found on Christopher's left thigh and under the binding on his left ankle. Now, I'm not a smart man, Jenny, but I know what hair is. I sure don't know what hair-like material is, though. Like, a wig? Christopher's right wrist was bound to his right ankle with a black shoelace, and his left wrist was bound to his left ankle with a white shoelace. And because this was the early 90s, people immediately concluded the murders had something to do with a satanic cult. To be clear, there was close to no real evidence of satanic cult stuff happening anywhere, especially not enough to warrant the so-called panic the media latched onto. I'm no sociologist, and I've only done a modicum of digging into this, but if I had to armchair quarterback it, I'd say that in the disillusionment that followed the peace and love generation of the 60s and early 70s, several cultural subgroups arose in response. One of which was, I don't know what to call them, metalheads? Goths? Kids who wore mostly black, listened to bands like Metallica and Black Sabbath, and fucked around with candles and shit. They conformed to a general lack of conformity and a rejection of mainstream religion. Whether or not kids were meeting out in the woods to do drugs and have orgies, as many a local news program liked to squawk, who knows? But you know who was famous for doing that kind of thing? The peace and love generation. So, meeting in the woods to take drugs and have orgies is not the sole prerogative of kids who listen to Megadeth or whatever. But 3 little boys were dead, and someone had to pay. Enter Damien Eccles, a 17-year-old introvert who wore black and had evil tattooed on his knuckles. Damien was already on law enforcement's radar. According to the piece on the UMKC School of Law website by Professor Douglas O. Linder, titled West Memphis 3 Trial and Account, quote, Eccles was a 17-year-old dropout with a history of psychiatric problems, including major depression. Eccles wrote dark poems, dressed mostly in black, wore long hair, had a tattoo on his upper arm, and was a self-described Wiccan. In the previous couple of years, Eccles allegedly had threatened his former girlfriend and the boy she was then dating, as well as his father. During part of a several-month stay with his mother in Oregon in 1992, Eccles had been admitted to a psychiatric ward and placed under suicide watch. Returning to Arkansas in the fall, Eccles briefly entered a juvenile detention center before being transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Little Rock after biting and attempting to suck blood from the arm of another detainee. Following his release from the Little Rock Hospital, Eccles returned to West Memphis, where he met regularly with his social worker at a mental health center. The social worker reported in her notes that Eccles told her he might become another Charles Manson or Ted Bundy, end quote. I mean, admitting you think you might become another Charles Manson or Ted Bundy isn't a great look, but kids are dumb, and kids who are depressed are dumb and desperate, and everything feels huge. Also, this was probably a cry for help. So police questioned Damien 3 times between May 7th and 10th. He told investigators he didn't know the boys, and whoever did this was sick. He said he'd spent the evening of May 5th at home with his mother, talking on the phone with 2 girlfriends in Memphis. According to FamousTrials.com, Lieutenant James Sudbury noted Damien said, quote, "The killer is probably someone local and that he won't run," end quote. Sudbury also noted that Eccles, quote, "likes to read books by Stephen King." I guarantee you if Damien had said he liked to read the Bible, it wouldn't have been noted. Damien willingly took a polygraph test. The administering officer concluded that he, quote, "recorded significant responses indicative of deception." But Damien was only a kid, and everyone had already decided that this was a cult killing, including Chief Gitchell, who had announced as much to the media. So there had to be more than one killer. It also stands to reason that one kid would have a hard time subduing 3 little kids all at once. And so, the police went searching for a cult. Strangers, you know I don't mess around with my sleep. There are a lot of things that go into a good night's sleep. Your mattress is one of those things. And if you want good quality sleep, you want a good quality mattress. Avocado focuses on real materials that are designed to perform. More breathable, more comfortable, and built to last. Real materials support cleaner airflow and a more comfortable sleep environment, which means less stuffiness, less interrupted sleep. Avocado uses certified organic, non-toxic materials, reducing unnecessary synthetic additives and extra treatments in your sleep space. Avocado is designed to support deep, restorative sleep so your body can properly recover, reset, and you can wake up ready to take on your day. Choosing organic, sustainably sourced materials means you're making a healthier choice for yourself while supporting cleaner, more responsible production. Plus, Avocado has sleep trials of up to 1 year to ensure you're getting the best mattress for you. When it comes to what you sleep on, Real wins. Real is better. Go to avocadogreenmattress.com/strange to check out their mattress and bedding sale. That's avocadogreenmattress.com/strange. avocadogreenmattress.com/strange. Police turned their attention to Damien's friends, of whom there were not many because of the whole introvert-outsider thing. They honed in on 16-year-old Jason Baldwin, who, despite also having the word evil tattooed across his knuckles, was a baby-faced little kid with good grades and a talent for drawing. Not that that precluded him from being a killer, but go look at a picture of him from 1993. And then, in late May, a woman named Vicky Hutchison inserted herself in the investigation with what Professor Linder called quite a tale. Vicky claimed a young man named Jesse Miskelly, who provided occasional help with yard work and childcare, introduced her to Damien. Jesse had gone to the same school as Damien and Jason at one point, but had dropped out. Damien, Vicky said, came to her house. According to the transcript of her interview with investigators, Vicky said she and Damien, quote, talked about, lots of different stuff. He's not real talkative. You kind of have to pull things out of him, but he, kept telling me about the boys' murders and how he never said questioned. He always said that I was accused for 8 hours. I was accused of killing those 3 little boys. And I said, I just acted like it was no big deal, but I didn't even know what. And I said, well, why would they pick you? In West Memphis, there are bukus of people. Why would they just pick you out? And he just looked at me. Just really weird, and said, because I'm evil. Evil. E-V-I-L. End quote. At this point, the officer asked her if Damien denied killing the boys, and Vicky said he didn't. Vicky then seems to have gone on a rogue undercover mission. She claimed to have bought some books on witchcraft as bait to get Damien to admit to, worshipping Satan or whatever. She said she told Damien she wanted to become Wiccan, to which he replied by inviting her to an orgy. Because that's what Wiccans do, okay? Vicky claimed that Damien drove her and Jesse to an SBAT, described as a gathering of witches, in a red Ford Escort on May 19th. She stated that the SBAT took place in a field outside of town, and 10 other young people were there, all of whom she said couldn't have been older than 18. Vicky described a group of kids with their faces and arms painted black, stripping and touching each other. She said that those in the orgy used nicknames for each other like Spider, Snake, and Lucifer. Vicky told police that when the orgy began, she told Damien she wanted to leave. She said Damien took her home, leaving Jesse there. Vicky, it should be noted, was around 30 years old at this time, so what she was doing hanging out with teenagers is anyone's guess. Jesse, by the way, was 17 and had an IQ of 70. Also, not for nothing, but Damien didn't own a car or truck, and definitely didn't drive a red Ford Escort. Vicky also claimed her son Aaron, who was the same age as the 3 victims and who had supposedly been friends with them, had spied on the orgy kids in the woods before. She told police, quote, "He said they paint themselves and they have dragon shirts and they talk in Spanish." And I say, "Aaron, they talk in Spanish. How do you know that's Spanish? I mean, you don't know Spanish." He said, "Well, I don't understand what they're saying. And they sing bad things." And I said, "Like, what kind of bad things?" My father, being a preacher, Aaron has been in my church quite often, and he said they sing things about the devil and, that we love the devil. And he said, "I think they love the devil more than God, Mom." And I told him, "You know what? Why didn't y'all leave? Why didn't you come here? Were you scared?" They said, "No, we hid. They couldn't see us." He said, "Well, when they first saw them, they sat around a fire in a circle by this tree. He made several comments and, they did this like several times and then they'd sing a song and they'd, dance around the tree." Then he told me that these 5 men took their clothes off. And I said, "Aaron, you know that they took their clothes off. Why didn't you leave?" And he said, "Because we were scared." And they were scared, I guess, of getting caught then. And he said Michael kept telling me that it was an Indian thing they were supposed to do. And Chris said, "No, they're getting ready to have sex." And I told Aaron doesn't know about sex. And we talked about it in all the books that you've seen. He said that they had their Peters in each other's butts and said they watched. End quote. More on Vicky later, but for now, based on this account, police picked up Jesse. His father did not formally give permission for his son to be interrogated, and frankly, I don't know why he allowed Jesse to go with the police alone, but he did. Once at the station, police told Jesse that there was a $35,000 reward for information leading to the capture/conviction of the killers. Now, I can't tell you for sure that these people didn't have a lot of money, but I think it's a relatively safe bet that $35,000 was the kind of money that could make a major difference in the Miss Kelly's lives. And if you think the police took the opportunity to interrogate a minor with serious learning impairments without a parent or lawyer present for many hours, you're right. What would ensue over the next many hours would lay the groundwork for the trial, effectively changing the lives of teenaged Jesse, Jason, and Damien forever. Police subjected Jesse to hours of interrogation using tactics that are now all too familiar. I mean, honestly, at this point, it's so cliche, it's embarrassing. Jesse would later recount, quote, "I kept telling Inspector Gitchell and Detective Ridge I didn't know who did it. I just knew of it, what my friend had told me. But they kept hollering at me. They kept saying they knew I had something to do with it because other people had told them. After I told him what the 3 boys were wearing, Gary Gitchell told me, was any of them tied up? That's when I went along with him. I repeated what he told me. I said, yes, they were tied up. He asked, what was they tied up with? I told him a rope. He got mad. He told me, God damn it, Jesse, don't mess with me. He said, no, they was tied up with shoestrings. I had to go through the story again until I got it right. They hollered at me until I got it right. So whatever he was telling me, I started telling him back. But I figured something was wrong because if I'd have killed him, I'd have known how I'd done it. End quote. Jesus Christ. These statements weren't the only ones police hammered Jesse on. They asked him when he went into the woods with Damien and Jason, which he at first said he didn't do to begin with, and he said it had been around noon, to which Gitchell and Ridge were like, wasn't it after school? And Jesse would be like, oh yeah, I guess it was after school. So after hours of this back and forth, they finally turned on the tape recorder and took Jesse's statement. Ultimately, Jesse claimed to have watched Damien hit Chris Byers in the head, quote, with his fist and bruised him all up real bad. And then Jason turned around and hit Steve Branch. Then the other one took off. Michael Moore took off running, so I chased him and grabbed him and held him until they got there, and then I left, end quote. Jesse stated that when he returned to the scene minutes later, all 3 boys had their clothes off and were tied up. Quote, "Then they tied them up, tied their hands up. They started screwing them and stuff, cutting them and stuff, and I saw it and turned around and looked, and then I took off running. I went home. Then they called me and asked me how come I didn't stay. I told them I just couldn't." End quote. And just about an hour after Jesse made his official statement, all 3 boys were picked up and arrested for the murders of Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch. Judge David Burnett presided over the pretrial hearing held in Marion, Arkansas on August 4th, during which he ruled Jesse would be tried separately from Jason and Damien, and that his confession could be introduced into evidence against defense objections that the confession was coerced. Also, Jesse's trial would go first, presumably because Jesse was the only one who'd given a confession, and so the judge likely figured it would be an easy case and one they could use in the trials against the other 2. Oh, and also, all 3 boys would be tried as adults. Strangers, this episode is brought to you by Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first bake-from-frozen subscription box for sourdough breads, artisanal pastries, and fresh pastas. All items conveniently bake in 25 minutes or less. Unlike many store-bought options, Wild Grain uses simple ingredients you can pronounce and a slow fermentation process that can be easier on your belly and richer in nutrients and antioxidants. There's no preservatives and no shortcuts. Plus, Wild Grain's boxes are fully customizable. In addition to their variety box, they have a gluten-free box, a vegan box, and now a new protein box. Winter in my house means soups and stews, and absolutely nothing goes better with a hot bowl of soup than a nice, crusty, warm piece of sourdough with Wild Grain's slow-churned butter. Or a toasted croissant loaf with hazelnut spread with my morning coffee? Delicious. Wild Grain even has slow-fermented hot dog buns for you parents out there who are trying to sneak in something healthy around all the processed foods our kids love. There's nothing like having an artisan bakery in your freezer to chase away the winter chill. Now is the best time to stay in and enjoy comforting homemade meals with Wild Grain. I highly recommend giving Wild Grain a try. Right now, Wild Grain is offering our listeners $30 off your first box, plus free croissants for life when you go to wildgrain.com/strange to start your subscription today. That's $30 off your first box and free croissants for life when you visit wildgrain.com/strange, or you can use promo code STRANGE at checkout. Jesse's trial began in January 1994. He was represented by a very new public defender, Dan Stidham. Prosecutor John Fogelman, as Professor Linder put it, quote, took jurors on a disturbingly graphic journey. He had the victims' bicycles propped up against the wall of the courtroom and presented jurors with graphic photos of the boys. Now listen, I watched the HBO documentary Paradise Lost, and I was not prepared for the footage of the boys' bodies that appeared in the first few seconds of the film. You know me, stranger, I am not one for gratuitous violence, and I tend to avoid going into graphic detail. So when I tell you I gasped, turned my head away, and held my hands over my face for a good minute, I'm not lying. My entire body tensed up involuntarily. I have to be honest, I don't know that those shots were necessary. I think the brutality of the murders is apparent in their descriptions. I don't know what seeing the photographs did for the audience except traumatize us. If I were those boys' parents, I would have strongly objected. Anyway, here are some of the autopsy findings. All 3 boys were nude. Christopher's scalp was bloody. His face and both of his ears had several abrasions and contusions, indicating he had likely been hit in the face several times. The base of his skull had multiple fractures, and his brain showed signs of hemorrhage. His penis had been skinned, and his scrotum and testes were missing. There were multiple puncture wounds on what remained of his penis. It was determined that Christopher's cause of death was the multiple injuries to his head. Michael had a strand of fabric-like material clenched in his left hand. He had multiple contusions, scratches, and abrasions on both ears and all over his face. He had multiple subdural contusions, and his skull was fractured in almost a dozen places. His brain showed signs of hemorrhage. Stevie's body was covered in leaves, mud, and debris. His scalp was bloody. He had some petechiae in his left eye. He had multiple contusions, lacerations, and abrasions to his ears and face. He had multiple cutting wounds on the left side of his face. The base of his skull was fractured, and his brain showed signs of hemorrhage. His neck showed no signs of injury. He had multiple scattered abrasions to his chest. The cause of Michael and Stevie's death was injuries and drowning. There was no sign that any of the boys had been sexually assaulted. Now, Lord knows, I am a lot of things. I am exceptionally attractive and full of a zest for life. When people think of me, they think, wow, that Daisy sure is zesty and attractive. But one thing I'm not is an expert on occult-style killings. So forgive me if I'm way off base here, but nothing about the injuries to these little boys, nor the scene around them, suggests anything cult-related. If you believe that Christopher's penis was intentionally skinned and his testicles and scrotum were intentionally removed, you could perhaps draw some conclusions as to the motive of his murder, something psychosexual perhaps. But there were no pentagrams either on the ground around the boys or cut into the boys' skin, which every so-called expert in cults in the 80s and 90s seemed to unequivocally agree was the #1 calling card of every cult-related murder. Prosecutor Fogelman told the jury how calm Jesse had been during his confession and played all 39 minutes of the more than 5-hour interrogation for the jury. Jesse's calm demeanor, he argued, pointed to his guilt. I suppose if he'd been hysterically crying, they could have thrown the confession out? Lisa Sakavikius from the Arkansas Crime Lab came in to testify that fibers found on a Cub Scout cap of one of the boys, one green, one red, were microscopically similar to fibers found on shirts owned by Damien and Jesse. Listen, my shit may be microscopically similar to yours, but that, pardon the expression, doesn't mean shit. This was, mind you, the only piece of physical evidence the state had against Jesse. And then, on cross-examination, the crime lab's findings appeared even less probative after Sakavikius conceded that many fibers are microscopically similar to each other, and that the, quote, discovery proved nothing. Defense attorney Stidham called Detective Warren Holmes, a polygraph examiner known for his involvement with such high-profile cases as Watergate, JFK's assassination, and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Since, according to Judge Burnett, discussion of polygraphs was not admissible in court under Arkansas law, Holmes had to testify without the jury present, what's known as a proffered testimony, to discuss his reasoning as to why he suspected Jesse's interrogation led to a false confession. He laid out 3 warning signs of such cases. 1, having the subject tell you nothing you don't already know. 2, having what they do say not fit with known facts of the case. And 3, having the story of the crime not told in narrative form. Seeing all 3 in Jesse's confession, Holmes concluded that these maneuvers could well have beaten Jesse down to the point of giving up. After finishing his proffered testimony, Burnett allowed Holmes to testify in front of the jury only concerning a few matters, such as the fact that Jesse, quote, certainly knows the difference between shoelaces and a rope. Stidham then called Dr. Richard Offshay, a social psychologist, to testify about the coercion Jesse experienced during his interrogation and how that could lead to an involuntary confession. The prosecution objected to his testimony, stating that determining whether or not the confession was coerced was for the jury to decide, not an expert. Judge Burnett made clear where he stood on the matter. Quote, I'm not prepared to allow him to testify that in his opinion, the confession is coerced and therefore invalid. I mean, what the hell do we need a jury for? End quote. I mean, I thought you needed a jury to hear all the arguments from people like, I don't know, experts before making a decision? Of course, we all know by now that experts are not to be trusted in general, at least not according to the world's leading brainworm host, RFK Jr. Stidham argued that the issue of coercion was important as it questioned the validity of the charges. Burnett ended up allowing Offshea to testify that, quote, Miss Kelly had given police a false statement when he could no longer stand the strain of the interrogation, end quote. Offshea also told jurors that people who have low self-esteem or are mentally handicapped, two apt descriptions of Jesse, are especially at risk of responding to coercive and overly persuasive tactics. Offshea was not allowed to tell jurors, however, that in his opinion, the tactics used by the West Memphis Police Department overrode Jesse's will and resulted in a false confession. Seems like an important piece of the puzzle, but also, if his opinion was that Miss Kelly gave a false statement, regardless of the reason, then it seems to me that should have been important. And even though the defense had evidence, or at the very least the strong opinion of an expert in the field, of coercion and a false confession, in closing statements, Fogelman said, quote, there is absolutely not one iota of evidence that Ridge and Gitchell have told anything other than the truth in this courtroom. There's no evidence of any form of coercion. What is the defense? Are they saying that the defendant was brainwashed? Is that what they're saying? End quote. Girl, they don't know what he's saying because you wouldn't let him say it. The state, for some reason, also got to make closing statements. Don't ask me, I don't know, in which they said, quote, the defense's so-called experts had tried through smoke and mirrors to make it sound like a person that confesses to such a heinous crime and admits their involvement and gives you specific details of the involvement was forced to do so, end quote. He asked jurors to, quote, apply your common sense and do what's right. But the truth of it was, Jesse hadn't told investigators anything they didn't already know, and he was absolutely coached on his answers. Stidham introduced Jesse's alibi at trial. There were a good handful or two of witnesses who said they were with Jesse at the time the boys were murdered. According to those witnesses, Jesse had spent the day roofing, at a trailer park with some friends, and a few miles away at a wrestling match. Prosecution worked very hard to poke holes in witness statements, mostly accusing them of conflating dates and times, or just flat out lying. And somehow, without a shred of actual evidence, and plenty of reasonable doubt, the jury found Jesse guilty on all three counts. With Jesse's conviction, the prosecution now had a loaded gun for the trials of Damien and Jason. Jason was offered a deal in private. If he said Damien killed the boys, he would get a reduced sentence. He was facing life in prison, possibly even the death penalty. And at 16 years old, Jason said his mother raised him not to lie, so he wasn't going to lie about Damien's guilt, just to free himself. In Fogelman's opening statement, he said, quote, through scientific evidence and the statements of these own defendants, that he would prove that they caused the deaths of Michael Moore, Stevie Branch, and Chris Byers. But once again, their evidence was far from scientific. One of their main arguments for Damien's guilt was that he was weird. On the stand, one of the officers who'd searched Damien's house stated he found, quote, 11 black t-shirts, the book Never on a Broomstick, and the skull of a dog, end quote. Listen, I have at least 11 black t-shirts, a book on practical magic for beginners on my altar, along with candles, herbs, and incense, and my mom's ashes, and we have the pelvis of a deer with rhinestones glued into the sockets on a bookshelf in our living room. But I can't imagine having to administer my son or husband a shot if they needed it, let alone plunging a knife into someone's flesh. Detective Ridge testified that Damien told him everyone has demonic forces in them, but, isn't that just kind of a fact of Christianity? At the very least, it seems to this heathen that the devil is just waiting for a split second where you let your guard down to get all up in you and make you do bad shit, right? Like the whole point of heaven is to prevent you from doing bad shit while you're alive. He also said Damien had discussed with him the significance of the number 3 in the Wiccan religion. You know another religion that's big into the number 3? Christianity. It's kind of famous for it. Fogelman also asked that the judge take judicial notice that according to the almanac, May 5th was a full moon, a request the judge found appropriate. The moon's phase was appropriate, but a coerced confession was not. I mean, just LOL. I don't even know what to say about this. The prosecution then called Dr. Dale Griffiths, who was described as a cult expert from Ohio. When asked on cross-examination whether the number 3 might also have special significance in the Christian belief system, Griffiths said, quote, "I cannot make that statement." You can't? For real? Griffiths claimed the boys had used, quote, "the trappings of occultism" during the murders, pointing to, quote, "the time of the moon phase and the removal of blood." Asked what significance the sucking of blood might have, Griffiths explained, quote, "Blood is the life force, and usually they prefer to have a child that is young, very young, and the younger, the more innocent, the better the life force," end quote. There is no evidence that any of the victims' blood had been sucked. There was hardly any DNA collected at the scene at all, and what had been collected, a strand of hair found inside the knot of the ligature used to tie up Michael, and a strand of hair found on a nearby stump, wasn't tested, for some reason. Also, it is extremely important to note that Griffiths was a hack. He'd gotten his master's and PhD in occult studies through a correspondence course that included absolutely no classes. He worked with a mentor who'd apparently gotten his PhD through the same correspondence college and claimed to have read 4,800 books and written a 200-page dissertation. He had not met Damien or Jason, and when asked if he had met with Jason, he said, "I don't know who that is." In response to all this, on the stand, Damien described Wicca as, quote, "basically a close involvement with nature." When asked about the dog skull, he stated he had it because he, quote, "just kind of thought it was cool." He essentially said the same thing about having evil tattooed across his knuckles. When asked why he always wears black, he said, quote, "I was told that I look good in black and I'm real self-conscious, the way I dress," end quote. This is absurd. Asking an 18-year-old to explain any of their fashion choices is like asking a 3-year-old why they like chicken nuggets. The prosecution also brought in Vicky Hutchison. Remember her? She was the 30-year-old single mother who claimed to have hung out with Damien and Jesse and said they took her to an orgy in the woods. Vicky repeated her story on the stand. Now, I wouldn't call myself an expert on drug use, but it doesn't take a DARE counselor to know this woman was in the middle of a pretty serious drug habit. The woman was on meth, okay? And that's not to say that people on meth can't tell the truth, but I would venture a guess that her grasp on reality was loose. She was, at the very least, probably extremely suggestible. Another witness came in the form of a cellmate of Jason's who claimed Jason had confessed to murdering the 3 little boys. The next witness, medical examiner Frank Peretti, was handed a serrated knife Fogelman claimed had been found behind Damien's house. Peretti was like, "Oh, yeah, sure, this knife is consistent with the wounds found on the body of Chris Byers." On cross-examination, he was forced to admit he wasn't claiming it was the murder weapon. Also, on the day the knife was found, in a pond behind Damien's house, Gitchell had called local media to tell them something was about to happen there. He apparently told a diver exactly where to look for the knife, and wouldn't you know, with local media crews there, the diver surfaced with the knife. This was a large knife, like at least 6 inches long. One source said the blade was 9 inches long. None of the victims had stab wounds consistent with a large, serrated knife. At most, the boys had scratches on various parts of their bodies. At most, there were the wounds to Christopher's genitals, none of which were consistent with a large, serrated knife. Honestly, and I'm angry I even have to say this or have it be a thing that lives in my head now, I don't even know how one would go about skinning a very small penis. Please do not DM me with your theories. The prosecution entered Damien's journal into evidence and had him read several passages from it. Quote, question, I notice on the inside of the front cover there appears to be a couple quotes there. Could you read each of those to the jury and tell them where they came from? Answer, quote, life is but a walking shadow. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's from A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. Pure black looking clear, my work is soon done here. Try getting back from me that which used to be. That is off a Metallica tape called And Justice for All. Talks about how warped the court systems are, stuff like that. The other one is from The Twilight Zone. I've kicked open a lot of doors in my time, and I'm willing to wait for this one to open, and when it does, I'll be waiting. End quote. Very scary. The defense then called their final witness, Robert Hicks, quote, a police training officer with expertise about satanic crime. Quote, Hicks testified that he knew of no connection between sexual mutilation and the occult. Hicks also stated that there was empirical evidence showing that listening to Metallica did not lead to committing crime. Hicks also came for Griffith's testimony. Quote, he described the phrase trappings of the occult, used by prosecution expert Dale Griffiths, as absolutely meaningless in considering any kind of violent crime. End quote. There were a ton of pieces of evidence that at the very least introduced reasonable doubt. There was a man who'd stumbled into a nearby Bojangles restaurant on the evening of the murders, apparently disoriented and covered in blood. The responding officer took the witness statement through the drive-through window and never even entered the restaurant. The samples of blood collected at the restaurant were somehow lost and never tested. No follow-up interviews were ever conducted, and at trial, Fogelman argued that it was, quote, a complete absurdity to think the criminals who took pains to hide bodies, clothing, and bicycles would immediately thereafter go into a public place all covered in blood. I suppose it's a complete absurdity to think that someone who committed a crime like this may have been high and therefore may have behaved unpredictably. Damien's lead attorney, Val Price, reminded the jury that there was almost no physical evidence connecting Damien with the murders. I don't even know what physical evidence there actually was connecting him to the murders. And, quote, that having weird things in your room doesn't mean you're guilty of murder. Despite all this, the jury found both boys guilty on all counts. Jason received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, and Damien received the death penalty. He was set to be killed by lethal injection 2 months later, on May 5th, exactly a year after the murders of Stevie, Christopher, and Michael. Stranger, I don't even know what to say about this. Sometimes I am, believe it or not, speechless. A jury of 12 adult humans found an 18-year-old child guilty of murder beyond a reasonable doubt, despite there being no evidence, and then sentenced that child to death. As dark as it is to imagine the fates of these 3 boys, this young and tied without evidence to the heinous murder of 3 others, this verdict would prove unacceptable to so many outside the courtroom and across the globe. Those who could see that a true injustice had been done, and those who related to being scapegoated simply for being different. The fight for Jesse, Damien, and Jason's freedom was underfoot, and with it, the fight for Christopher, Stevie, and Michael's honor in search of what really happened. Next time on Strange and Unexplained, in part 2 of this story, we look at the extraordinary efforts of concerned people from all across the world to free the West Memphis 3. Strange and Unexplained is a production of Three Goose Entertainment and Grab Bag Collab. This episode was written by me with research by Joe Gordette, Becca DiGregorio, and me. Editorial help from Becca DiGregorio, sound engineering and design by Jeff Devine, music by Epidemic and Blue Dot Sessions. If you have an idea for an episode or want to submit a question for an Ask Me Anything episode, head to strangeandunexplainedpod.com and fill out the contact form. I will write back. Eventually. I need an assistant. You can follow me on social media at Daisy Egan or follow the show at SNU Pod and Grab Bag Collab. Stay strange.